Hello guys, this is Movie Storm. Today, we'll tell you about a movie where a man gets stuck in an elevator during a zombie apocalypse, titled The End. Young and cynical businessman, Claudio Verona, as usual heads to the office. At the entrance, he is greeted by a young girl named Sylvia, who is trying her best to please the business shark. Being fond of women, he notices her initiative and informs her that she's hired. Heading to his office, Claudio enters the elevator and accidentally meets Martha. There were relations between the two people for several months, but the girl decided to break up with the boss because her boyfriend proposed to her. Furthermore, her lover is married, and she doesn't want to play a secondary role. Claudio tries to convince Martha that only he can give her true feelings, but she firmly tells him that her decision is final and not up for discussion. When the former lover exits on her floor, the businessman answers a call from his wife. Lorena anxiously informs him that there are numerous reports of mass riots in the city's news. At that moment, the elevator gets stuck, and Claudio ends the call. Reporting the breakdown, he calls his assistant, Sarah, and asks her to delay an important client, whom he is in a hurry to meet. After spending over half an hour trapped, Claudio receives a message that Santi couldn't wait for him, and is leaving for his own matters. Verona gets furious and asks the dispatcher for the phone number of the repairmen. When he calls for the repairmen, he hears their loud screams, and then the connection is cut off. Realizing that help isn't coming quickly, Claudio tries to open the doors by himself. But he manages to slightly open the doors, only by a few centimeters, when Lorena calls. She tells him that someone is persistently knocking on the door of apartment. The woman is very frightened, especially since the city phones aren't working, and she can't call the police from her mobile. Her husband advises her to lock herself in the bedroom, and promises to send an assistant to handle everything. A few minutes later, Lorena calls again. She tells him about the news being broadcast on television. People on the streets seem to have gone mad, and are causing disorder. Authorities suspect some sort of terrorist attack. After hanging up, Claudio sees through the gap in the door, as Martha begs him for help, but something unknown drags her out of his sight. He wonders what's happening outside, until a disfigured Martha appears in the gap, along with another employee of the firm. They have turned into zombies, and are now trying to pull a frightened man out of the elevator, to feast on the flesh. Calling his assistant, Stefan, who is supposed to go to his wife, Verona tells about the horror that he just experienced. In response, Stefan calms the boss, but the connection cuts off at that moment. Completely desperate, the businessman presses the dispatcher call button again, but the dispatcher informs him that they can't reach the repair team. Claudio hears terrifying screams from the other end of the line, and then everything goes silent. Trying to reach someone, he approaches the door gap, and falls into the hands of zombie Martha. He manages to escape. To save himself, he tears off the handrail, and kills the woman. After, he pushes the corpse away. Taking out papers from his portfolio, the man begins to disgustingly wipe off the bloodstains that got inside the cabin. A few minutes later, he sees a frightened Sylvia. They try to widen the elevator doors to let the girl in, but upon hearing someone approaching, she runs further down the corridor. In that moment, an infected man appears in the doorway. He greedily reaches for the elevator's captive, but suddenly someone hits him on the head. It's Sylvia, who came back to help her boss. However, she can't save herself because a horde of zombies attacks her. Taking his mobile, Claudio gets online and sees that all the news is about a massive human infection. He dials his wife's number and breathes a sigh of relief when he hears her voice. Lorena is very scared because she saw with her own eyes how zombies attacked a reporter. At that moment, monsters break into the woman's apartment, and the man is forced to listen to her final pleas for help over the phone. After several hours, a surviving colleague appears in the corridor. He tries to enter the elevator, but the door's jammed, and they can't be fully opened. And Verona again watches as another living person dies. When the zombie horde starts rushing into the elevator, Sarah appears at the end of the corridor. Claudio tries to distract the monsters towards himself, but they rush towards a new victim, and the man with horror watches another person's demise. Turning on the news release on his phone, he sees that the city has incurred the wrath of heaven, as something incredible is happening around. The building goes dark, and after some time, a man from the special forces appears in front of the elevator. Claudio is relieved that help has arrived, but the man disappoints him. He came alone because he couldn't establish contact with the headquarters. Marcelo hands him a radio and a gun, then he goes to find the circuit breaker to restore electricity. When the fighter leaves, Verona listens attentively to everything that he describes through the radio. The entire building is cluttered with furniture and drenched in blood, but the man manages to progress towards his goal. After a few minutes, the lights in the building come back on. Claudio sees that the elevator doors have slightly moved, but something prevents them from opening. At that moment, zombies appear in the gap. Recalling all of Marcelo's instructions, he takes the gun and starts shooting at the creatures. Still reeling from shock, Claudio hears over the radio as the special force operative fends off the infected. When all falls silent, he realizes that he has lost yet another hope of rescue. Spending the entire night in tense anticipation, Verona contemplates suicide. He's ready to put a bullet in his head when he hears Marcelo's familiar voice. Marcelo managed to crawl through the elevator shaft and get into the cabin through the ceiling. Sitting on the floor, the men discuss what has happened. The enforcer of order is convinced that scientists created some kind of virus and couldn't contain it within the lab walls. He asks how within just a couple of hours, the city turned into a dwelling of bloodthirsty monsters. When the topic of family arises, Marcelo talks about a shelter where they sent all the family members of law enforcement personnel. In turn, Claudio tells about how he was forced to listen to his wife's final screams. He also laments that just a few hours before that, they had argued over a simple bottle of milk. At that moment, Marcelo starts coughing up blood. It turns out he's wounded, and now realizing he's about to turn into a zombie, he asks his new acquaintance to end his suffering. Verona waits until the last moment, and when Marcelo requests it, with tears in his eyes, he releases a bullet into his head. After another day, Claudio, periodically shooting zombies trying to break into the elevator, answers a call from an unfamiliar number. Hearing his wife's voice, he can't hold back tears of joy and thanks the heavens that his spouse is alive. Lorena tells him that she managed to escape from the apartment, where she was met by the military, and they took her to a shelter. At this point, the conversation ends because the battery is running out. Revitalized by the notion that the meaning of life is not lost, Claudio dislodges a component that prevented the elevator doors from opening and makes his way outside. He navigates through piles of corpses and steps out onto the street. There he witnesses complete chaos and a few more zombies. The military covers him from the attackers, giving him the chance to reach safety. And so, a common elevator malfunction saved a human life and gave a new purpose to an individual who seemed utterly lost. That is all for today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to give a thumbs up, leave a comment, and of course, subscribe if you're not already subscribed to this channel. This was Movie Storm. See you soon.